about. I know my colleagues are passionate about this topic as well. So we're very excited to be presenting with you today. The title of our presentation is Crucial Conversations, Confronting the Issue of Mental Health in Graduate School. And I first became interested in this topic as a graduate student. When I was working on my master's degree and working on my PhD, I struggled with mental health. I struggled with perfectionism, anxiety, imposter syndrome, all those fun things that graduate students tend to struggle with. And so this is a conversation and a topic that I'm really interested in talking about. So we'll quickly introduce ourselves and then we'll launch into our presentation. My name is Donna Hickman. I'm currently an assistant professor at Texas A&M Commerce. If you don't know where Commerce is, it's about an hour east of Dallas. A lot of people, when I tell them, they say, "Where's Commerce?" So I wanted to make sure everyone knew where that was, but we have campuses in the DFW area as well. I'm also the coordinator of the school counseling program. My background's in school counseling. I started my career as a fourth grade teacher, and then I was an elementary school counselor for 13 years north of Dallas. And now I'm in a counselor educator role at Texas A&M Commerce. So I'm thrilled to be presenting today, and I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited to be with you and to talk about such an important topic. I am Rebecca Mathews. I'm a clinical assistant professor at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. And like Donna, I had a wonderful opportunity to have a career as a counselor before moving into the space of counselor education. So we're seeing your screenshots, Donna. I was a counselor counselor for about 15 years, working primarily with adolescents and their families, and worked full-time while being in graduate school and understand the pains and frustrations that come with increased anxiety, increased workload, lack of support. Saw my peers in my program struggle as well. Now, as an educator, I have an opportunity to see how the pandemic is impacting graduate students as well, and seeing even more of a need for us to be able to talk about this really important topic. So I'm happy to be here.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mignon Jambon. I am a licensed professional counselor, supervisor, and have been practicing for over 15 years. I am currently a doctoral student at Texas A&M University Commerce. So I'm going through this process so I can speak firsthand about some of these things that we're going to be discussing today. I work for Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Illinois, Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Montana. I think I got them all. And I am what's called a medical liaison. So my passion is medical and mental comorbidity. So that's what I do. I make sure the medical people don't miss out on the behavioral health pieces and vice versa. So thanks for having us here.
Thank you. So just to kind of set the stage for our presentation, our agenda today is to start off with some real talk. We wanted to share with you some of the things we've been experiencing and our students have been experiencing this semester. So we'll talk first from a master student perspective and then from a doc student perspective. We'll look at some current research and some research from the 80s and 90s on graduate student mental health. And then we'll talk about how can we start to facilitate these conversations around mental health, and how can we make this a safe thing for students to do in our classrooms. And then we'll talk about some graduate level interventions. As we've been researching this topic, we've noticed that many of the interventions around mental health on college campuses tend to be directed towards undergraduate students. We want to make sure that our master students and doc students feel supported as well. So I'm going to start by talking about some of my sweet master students that I have. I work primarily with, this semester I'm working with many beginning master students who are just starting their programs. They're taking intro to counseling and counseling theories. And so my students are not only dealing with just the transition to graduate school, but also with a lot of other concerns. And so every time I would talk to a student this semester and hear what they were going through, I would send a screenshot to one of my colleagues and say, this is such an important topic. We have to talk about this. So when I was preparing this presentation, I sat down and I thought about what are some of the things that my students have been dealing with this semester. And so I wanted to share some of those things with you, just to give you an idea of what my group of students have been going through. So this is just since January, since the spring semester started. The first week of the semester, one of my students lost her mom from COVID. I've had multiple students that have been dealing with COVID themselves. I've had 2 students who going through a divorce, one going through a high conflict separation. I've had multiple students dealing with flooding and damage from the storms we had in Texas. In February, we had some pretty significant storms, and I had multiple students that were displaced from their homes, and some that are dealing financially with the fallout from those storms. I had one student tell me yesterday that she was having to withdraw this semester just from everything she's been dealing with since the storms hit. And so we're talking today about what her options are. Several students have talked to me about anxiety and depression. One has had to deal with a cancer diagnosis and surgery and chemotherapy. Many of my students are dealing with financial struggles and having to add additional work hours. So they're concerned about missing our Zoom classes. I have many students who are teachers who are working on becoming school counselors. And as you guys are probably aware, teachers are really struggling right now. Teaching during a pandemic is difficult. So teacher burnout is something I've been hearing a lot about. So they're trying to juggle the responsibility of being a teacher while also being a grad student. I have had some students who have been displaced and are moving back in with their family of origin, along with their own kids and their own partners. So they're dealing with some family conflict. Many of my students are reporting feeling isolated and disconnected due to COVID. It's very difficult to start a master's degree in the middle of a pandemic. So they're already feeling behind and stressed and isolated. And just adjusting to grad school in general is difficult for many of my students. Some of them have been in the work, have been working for a long time and are now adjusting to being back in school. And some are starting right after their undergrad. So I just wanted to give you a glimpse of just some of the things my students are dealing with. I try to make it a safe space for them to share with me. And that I know what I've shared with you today is just a very small part of what my students are dealing with. And so we'll transition to letting Mignon talk about some of her experiences as a doc student.
So along with all of the things that Donna talked about, we know that everyone is dealing with so many different things that are happening right now, but also the professors, the people who are teaching are also dealing with the same type of thing. And so I always keep that in mind when I start getting frustrated. It has been a frustrating year in a doc program because you don't have that camaraderie that you had when you were actually in a classroom. And there's a disconnect. I feel very disconnected from my peers and even the program itself and professors, where when you're obviously in a classroom and it's something that you're doing all the time, there is that personal connection. And you also, I always say, you overhear things from people as well. So you still kind of stay connected with things that maybe you don't realize you need to hear or know. And I say that because, there have been times in the past year where I didn't know about dates or deadlines that were coming up, and somehow they got missed and how they got put out. And so that's been some of the things that have been really frustrating. We have figured a way to work around it. Thank you for, text messaging and group text, so that we literally have group text with all of my comrades. So during class, we might be texting each other about something if it's not coming across in the lecture. We have multiple emails, but even trying to connect with professors has also been difficult, and getting answers to things. And, and as I said in the beginning, I know professors are going through this as well, and the burnout that Donna talked about. And the funny story that came out last week is I am almost done with my doc program, and my advisor had realized, oh my gosh, you are almost done. But because of the pandemic and everything going on, yeah, there's so much to try to keep track of. It's hard enough when you're in person, but obviously with the Zoom only and email only, it's made everything a little bit more difficult. And I've had to take extra steps. And for me, that's easy. I'm very much a type AJ person. So I will send emails and ask and re-ask and just make sure I know what's going on. But for people who don't do that, or maybe have difficulty doing that, it's just something that we need to think about, and that we're going to talk about, obviously, too, as we move on.
Thank you. So before we talk about some of the research, I wanted to check in with you guys as our audience and our participants today. Is there anyone who has any reaction to what we've shared so far? Any struggles that they've seen in their own students, or anything they wanted to share about any personal struggles?
I'll share. I remembered as a graduate student, I actually, the school I attended actually required that we get counseling, that we had to produce evidence that that was so. However, as an assistant professor in a program that I'm teaching right now, that's not a requirement. And I am seeing many students who are coming to me to be their counselor. So I constantly have to be aware to say, I cannot counsel you. Well, do you know someone that you could recommend? They wanted me to recommend someone within the institution. Of course, I could not. So I kind of gave them websites, but they still come to class expecting me to do some form of counseling for them. And so when I saw this, I thought it was very important, because I really am looking to grab something to take back to even my peers. This is something that we've all discussed as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. It's tough as a counselor educator. Sometimes the roles get blurred. I've definitely noticed that with my students too. So thank you so much for sharing that. Any other reactions or anyone wanting to share?
And feel free to unmute your mic or drop it in the chat, whatever's most comfortable for you.
Yeah, one thing I also wanted to add is another, some other research that really interested me in this topic was when I did a previous presentation just on doctoral student wellness. The statistics of students who don't finish their PhD are staggering. Anywhere from 40 to 70% of students who begin a doc student or who begin a doc program don't finish. And I mean, it was very interesting to me to see those statistics. I knew it was high, but I didn't know it was that high. So I feel like sometimes our doc students, we just assume they're doing okay because they're doc students, right? They're doing amazing. So I think that it's important to remember too that our doc students need just as much support as our undergrads and our master students. And that's why another reason why I'm so glad Mignon is joining us today to kind of talk to us from the trenches about what it's really like out there. Just some research that I wanted to share with you about graduate student mental health. In the references, you'll see several of the articles, but I just wanted to talk about some of the highlights. One of the articles talked about that graduate students are reporting such high levels of distress that some professionals are calling it a mental health crisis. And that's from a very recent study in 2021. And those words to me said something. I was really interested that so much recent research seems to be going in this direction, especially through the lens of COVID-19. I think it's so much more difficult. And research also, some other research that I've found, multiple studies indicated that graduate students disproportionately struggle with anxiety, depression, and other mental health issues. I know that my students struggle with these things, but it seems like some of our high achievers especially struggle with imposter syndrome and perfectionism and wanting to do their best and wanting to be amazing counselors. And we know that beginning counselors struggle with anxiety in general. And overall rates of self-reported depression and anxiety in one study were 6 times higher among graduate students compared to the general population. 6 times higher. And one interesting side note that I wanted to share with you guys is a study called the Big Ten Suicide Study. And this was a 10-year study from 1980 through 1990 to study suicide rates on Big Ten university campuses. And the study collected data on 261 suicides of students at 12 Midwestern campuses. And it talked about just how high the rate was among graduate students as compared to undergraduate students. And it was one of the first studies that really looked at this phenomenon. So if you're interested in reading more about that study, I have it in our references. And we'll go ahead, Rebecca.
I'm jumping in.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Because let's talk about how to do this. How do we have conversations with graduate students if we're noticing something, if we're concerned about something? And what does that look like? I think that sometimes when we conceptualize having a tough conversation, we kind of think of it like the image right there, that it's like tense and there's yelling and there's space between people and it feels really rough. But Donna, can you click the down button next? But I think that the goal would be that we actually have a collaborative, congenial conversation in a safe and secure way. The good news is we know how to do this. As educators, we've been trained in this. As counselors, we know how to do this. As mental health professionals, having a hard conversation is not something that's new. However, applying it to mental health has some contours and nuances we need to be aware of. So when we think about kind of the hierarchy of how do we go about having these conversations, we look at noticing that there's different levels for that. So we think about, and Donna, can we go to the next slide, please? We think about the foundation of essentially we have to start with the relationship. We have to be transparent and authentic in our approach. And then we need to broach and provide support around mental health. So we're going to walk through these 3 layers and how we do this. So the first layer is the relationship. We know that this is the foundation to every experience that we have, every relationship that we have. Donna, can you go to the next slide, please? That with our relationship, that sometimes it's referred to as the therapeutic relationship, the working alliance, the supervisory relationship, the teacher-student relationship. There's lots of different names. But at the core of it is this concept that there's a relationship between 2 people where you are demonstrating genuine and not authenticity, empathy, and unconditional positive regard. And Rogers, he actually had 6 different conditions for the therapeutic relationship. And one of them was the ability of the client to perceive the empathy of the therapist. And so when we think about it in this role, in this concept of education, that it's not enough for us to care and to have the empathy, that we have to make sure that we're presenting it in a way that our students are able to receive from us our empathy, care, and concern. What's hard is that we are wearing many hats. You may be a faculty member, educator, you might be over internship, placement, or field placement. You might be their advisor. You might be a member of your university's remediation committee. And so you would look at your students kind of through a different lens, or you're interacting with them in a different space. But regardless of the role, building that relationship is going to be important. We know that some of the early signs that there's a mental health struggle show up in graduate students by some of their behaviors. We might notice that they're missing class, or they're showing up late or leaving early. They're not participating as much in class. They're not responding to outreach when you do reach out to them. You might notice that they have decreased energy. They're missing deadlines. They're more irritable in their comments or their behavior, or in more extreme cases, you see more kind of strange, bizarre behavior that they might be demonstrating. The core of this, though, is you can't know if your student is having a mental health struggle if you don't know your student. And I will tell you transparently, as an educator that is also living through a pandemic and figuring out how to teach some classes for the first time and adjusting to all the new things, I feel overwhelmed too. I struggle too. My anxiety is higher just as much as my graduate students' anxiety is higher. In our school, we have larger cohorts than other programs, smaller than others as well. So our cohort sizes are about 35 students. So if I teach 3 classes a semester, so I have about 70 unique students across 3 classes that I'm teaching. That's a lot of names and people to get to know, especially at the very beginning of a semester. And yet it's important that I know them. It's hard because there's masks and shields and all the things that we have to deal with because of COVID. But it's important that there be some kind of a connection. We can't know if there's a change in their behavior if we don't know their name, if we don't know what their baseline behavior is. So really the first step of broaching mental health is getting to know your students and reaching out to them to build this relationship. The next step is really being able to have some transparency around the role that we have with our graduate students. Next slide, please, Donna. That it's kind of the big elephant in the room. Oh, just kidding. We're going to broach and then we're going to talk about transparency. No, you're fine, Donna. I think I just put it in the wrong order. So when we think about broaching, we think about kind of 3 steps that we need to take. We need to be aware, we need to be prepared, and we need to be willing to have conversations. So the first thing is to be aware. The students have the right to maintain their own personal health information. They are under no obligation to disclose to the university, to you as an individual, what their experiences are. And so it's important to kind of recognize the importance of that. They can choose to what degree they want to disclose, and that you have boundaries. Like we heard earlier, that we are not their counselors. We can be therapeutic individuals in their lives, and we can help to provide connections, but it's really clear that we honor our own boundaries and are explicit about what those boundaries are, and that we honor their boundaries, that we not press or pry in a space that wouldn't be helpful. We want to make sure that we're prepared as we consider broaching, thinking about what it might be like for a graduate student to hear their faculty members say, "I'm concerned about you." On one hand, they might feel seen, heard, known. On another hand, they might be thinking, this is a mental health professional telling me that I have mental health problems. And what I thought was maybe beneath the surface and nobody was realizing, apparently everybody knows about. That can be a very startling experience. And so we want to be very careful in the language that we're using, that we're demonstrating and talking about behaviors that we're seeing and not pathologizing or diagnosing, because that's not our role. So even if we perceive that we're maybe seeing some generalized anxiety, we're not going to use that verbiage. We're going to note the behaviors that we've noticed and ask to query, to broach about this conversation. And we want to be always mindful of the power differential that is present. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Being thoughtful about the time, place, and surroundings of this conversation of when we do broach. If they've just given a really big presentation and they're feeling exhausted, that might not be the best time. If they're about to go into class and about to give a really big presentation, that might not be the best time, right? If it's in a public space, I've noticed with Zoom, I've had a couple of students that will hang around after class and we'll talk. And just like now, if you look in the upper left-hand corner, there's a little recording button that demonstrates that we're recording. So when I have a student stay after, I immediately end the recording feature of Zoom to make sure that they have privacy in that space and that it's not something that's collected. And if I forget, then I immediately delete that recording and there's just no access to that class. Because again, they have a right to have protected information. That we be thoughtful about the things that we know about trauma-informed practices and need for cultural awareness, that we respect the parameters of those guidelines. And the other thing that we want to do as we're prepared to have these conversations is to understand what are your school and university resources and policies. I think one of the struggles that we have in the space of mental health, whether it's counseling, psychology, whatever the field is, social work, is that the campus resources are often run or manned by interns from our programs. And so it is unlikely that a student in one program is going to voluntarily go to see another program where they may interact with students or interact with other faculty that they might experience in a different way. And I think because of that, we have an obligation as educators to have an awareness of community-based resources that would be appropriate. Again, we're not making referrals, we're providing information about what some of the options are within the school and without. I think a great way of doing this is to partner with the campus counseling center and have a conversation about this potential conflict of barrier or relationship and collaborate with them on the development of a list. So then it's something that's coming from the counseling center that's then supporting students. Be mindful, as Donna had mentioned, about what are the policies with regards to dropping classes. If you have a student that is having a crisis and they need to withdraw, make sure that you know that information or are willing to get that information. A conversation I had yesterday with a student who is losing a grandparent and kind of expecting them to pass any day. And they said, I don't know what to do. Like, I can't get my assignments in. Do I just need to withdraw? So we spent time, we went through the grade book and we zeroed out the rest of the assignments for the end of the semester and realized that if she did absolutely nothing the rest of the semester, she'd get a C. So where could she do something to get a B? And, is there a way that she could participate and engage in a way that would allow her to complete the class while letting go of the perfectionism that says I have to get 100%. So being willing to have some of those conversations in a practical way can be really helpful as well. And then that takes us to our last point, which is to just be willing. Students need to be seen. They need to be heard. They need to hear their name. They need you to look in their eyes. They need you to know that you care about them and that you can express concern, recognizing you might do it wrong. Just like anytime we're learning to broach in any other situation, we might mess up a couple of times and that's okay. That's why the foundation of the therapeutic relationship, the teaching relationship, the supervisory relationship is so important because it creates space for us to mess up and still be okay. So the last thing we want to think about is really with regards to this concept of transparency, that we have to be authentic about the fact that we are in the role of an educator and we do have an obligation for gatekeeping. And so we can't set that aside. We have to be careful not to make promises we can't keep or that we should not keep. But we have boundaries and criteria that we have to follow as well, and we have legal obligations. And so rather than kind of pretending that this doesn't exist, we recommend bringing this into the conversation, being open about this, acknowledging the fact that part of my role is to assess and evaluate your performance. And we recognize that anxiety, depression, mental health struggles are part of the graduate student experience. So if I have concern about how you're doing, I'm not going to hang you out to dry. We're going to talk about it. We're going to connect you to resources. We're going to get you the support that you need. And if remediation is needed, what a great opportunity to make sure that we're all on the same page and rowing in the same direction to ensure that your health isn't compromised. I think sometimes when we think about this concept of gatekeeping, it's easy to think about the protecting the public concept, and that's absolutely true. We have an obligation to the community to protect the public from situations that could be adversarial for them. We also have a responsibility to make sure that our graduate students are healthy and in a good condition when they cross through the gate. So part of our gatekeeping process is making sure that they're not so battered and worn by the time that they're getting through there that they are going to do harm or that they leave the field entirely. And so it's about gatekeeping as protection, and gatekeeping is ensuring the quality of our students and their mental health is intact. Understand your legal and ethical responsibilities with regards to being a faculty member, and then document. What's great about documentation is it gives you a record of what things have looked like. Again, I've got 70 students and it's hard sometimes for me to keep track of conversations I've had with different students. So if I sent somebody to the counseling center or provided them information about the counseling center, I want to document that so that when they come to me again, I don't send them right back again, recognizing that's something we've already talked about. I find that it's helpful. I just email students. I say, thank you so much for talking with me. Here's a summary of what we talked about. It gives them a record that they can look back and refer to, so that had they dropped information or if their mind was just too full, that they can review it. It also gives me a trail of documentation, and then I just hold on to those emails. It's a simple and easy way of supporting the student, while also making sure that I'm doing the things that I need to do. I think my final word that I want to say about this role is that students are terrified. They are terrified that we as faculty are going to see something in them that's going to disqualify them for being a counselor or being a psychologist or being a social worker. And I think that we have an obligation to be able to clarify that perfection is not required to be in our field. We, just like you can have a broken arm and be a doctor, you can struggle with anxiety and be a counselor. And the concept and the goal is to have it not interfere. And as we normalize and talk about that, and we teach strategies so that students know how to ethically maintain and bracket off their own experiences, we set them up for success when they are in the field and they're having to do this in real life. If we avoid these conversations, we really miss that opportunity. So Donna, the next slide, please, going back to our hierarchy here. So let's start with the relationship. So wherever you are, again, as educators, we're overwhelmed too. So if you don't know all of your students, that's the first step. Get to know your students, send them out an email, and we'll talk about some specific strategies in a minute. Really listen to them when they're talking. Be transparent and authentic about what your role is. Bring that role into the relationship and be honest about what those boundaries look like. And be willing to broach, be willing to seek permission to talk about this, to ask it, to express concern. This is part of our role and obligation as educators.
So thank you, Rebecca, for that. We wanted to transition into some interventions that we could discuss about what we can do once we recognize that our students are struggling, once we are making an effort to form that relationship with them. What can we do at the graduate level to help them? So we'll talk about some things we can do, and then we'll allow you to share as well. But the first thing that I would recommend is just frequent and intentional check-ins with students. And that's something that many of you are probably doing already. One thing that I've found helpful is in the beginning of the semester, when you're in that introduce yourself phase, is I keep a Google Doc of important things to note about students, where they work currently, what they've shared about their family, things like that. And then I actually make a list of students spread throughout the semester, and I check in with those students throughout the semester. So I'm making it to where I'm actually making it a calendar appointment to check in with certain students. I find that the more intentional I am, that's helpful to me, and making sure that all of my students are being connected with. And what I found is that students aren't likely to maybe come to you with issues or come to me with issues. But if I put it out there and I make an effort to just check in with them and see how they're doing, not only do they truly appreciate it, but they're more willing to share. So it's just, and sometimes students are really surprised if I just email them out of the blue and say, I just wanted to check in and see how your semester's going, how are your classes going. I feel like students really appreciate that. And at the end of the semester, often they will tell me that's their favorite part about the class, that I seem to care about them as a student, and not just as an academic person who submits assignments. The second thing that I've found to be really helpful is to be willing to share our own struggles. I have found that as I become more authentic and transparent with my students, they are willing to become more authentic and transparent with me. When I was a master's student, I was teaching during the day and then driving to my classes at night. And so I would be in class from 4:30 to 10, and I had to be at school the next morning at 7, and I wasn't sleeping. I just wasn't sleeping. I was too wired from class, and I was really, really struggling. And so I share that with my students. I share, especially my master's students, what it's like to try and juggle the role of student, of someone who also has a full-time job, someone who also has a family. If I can share those struggles with them, they're willing to share them with me. And I'm also willing to share that I struggle as a counselor educator. I think sometimes students put professors on this pedestal. So I'm trying to be unafraid to share with them that I struggle too. I talk with them about my own counseling. I talk with them about my own anxiety, my own perfectionism, my own imposter syndrome. And I feel like just having those conversations normalizes it for them. If I struggle, then maybe it's okay for them to struggle too. And I've had multiple students reach out to me and say that they didn't realize it would be okay for a counselor to get counseling. Yes, they knew it would be okay to get those 10 required sessions, but they, for some reason, think that if they struggle at all, like Rebecca said, if they struggle at all with their mental health, that will somehow disqualify them from becoming a counselor. So I try to make it very clear that it is okay to struggle. It's okay to need help, and how to confront that when we do start to struggle. Another idea that Dr. Mathews talked about is to give students permission to self-regulate in class. I've had students email me saying, I had oral surgery today, and is it okay if I have my camera off? And when I read that, I thought, oh my gosh, I need to say something about that. I need to let students know that it's okay to have your camera off. It's okay if you need to take a break in the middle of class. And if you're in person, let students, let them be able to do things that they need to do. If they need to stand up during class, if they need to walk around during class, if they need to take a minute to breathe during class, giving them permission to do that and to take care of their own needs sometimes is better than just assuming that they know it's okay. A university counseling center is an awesome resource for our students, and our counseling center is amazing. But what I found is their interventions are directed towards students who are living on campus and who are actually attending class as undergraduates. And so I've talked with our counseling center about how can we reach our master's students too. Sometimes when students ask me about counseling recommendations and I talk to them about the University Counseling Center, they have no idea that that's even an option, that as a student, they can go to the counseling center for free and get mental health support. So I think just using your University Counseling Center as a resource is awesome. I've had ours guest lecture in my classes. I've had them talk to our classes about what the counseling center provides and what's there for them. And I think students are thrilled to know that there's an additional resource for them on campus. We have to remember that it's not just our undergrads that need help. Sometimes it's our master's students and doc students are struggling. And last, focusing on social support and mentorship. I really talk to my students about, it's very hard to do these programs alone. It's hard to feel like you're going through these programs alone. Whether you're a master's student or a doc student, I try to encourage my students to connect with other students in the class, give them opportunities to connect. We have, in my classes, we have the VIP after party where sometimes we stay after class, after our Zooms, and just talk about stuff. And the first week, our VIP after party was another student and me. And last week we had probably half the class in our VIP after party. So just giving them opportunities to talk to each other can be helpful so that they don't feel alone going through the program. And lastly, mentorship. I had amazing mentorship in my doc program and in my master's program. But as counselor educators, being willing to reach out to students and offer to mentor them is something that could completely change a program around for a student. So I try to offer opportunities to present together, to work on things together, to just give them opportunities that they wouldn't necessarily have the courage to ask for. So those are some of the interventions that I've found helpful. And I wanted to, before Mignon shared some interventions, I wanted to share with you just some different things I use to check in with students. Sometimes in the beginning of class, it's good, you know, I always check in with students, and I'm sure all of us do that, where we just kind of do an emotional pulse check. But sometimes, just to change it up a little bit, I'll just maybe throw something like this up and have them check in and tell me how they're doing on this scale. And so sometimes we'll use something like this. I love any Instagram mental health resources. I love them all. So I have them in this PowerPoint for you. But using something like this just gives just students a springboard to share how they're feeling. Like, how are you doing today? How are you really doing today? Is one of my favorite questions to ask. And this one's kind of fun. Just where they can type it in the chat or even respond with an emoji if they want to. If any of you have group me's with your class or any kind of technology, this is a fun one to use with students, and just give them some structure when they're checking in.
So here are a few more interventions. Wait, yes, there we go. I'm sorry. I was going to kind of piggyback a little bit on what Dr. Hickman said earlier about the intentional check-ins. In the DOC program right now, one of the things that a lot of my professors are doing is she does it, as Dr. Hickman said in the end. I have a lot of my professors that are checking in with everybody in the beginning. So for about the first 10 minutes of class, they're saying, hey, where are we? How are you guys doing? And also too, because we have had such a phenomenal year between COVID, but also what's happening politically and the cultural climate. There's been so much going on. And then of course, here in Texas, we had these horrible storms. And so it's nice that the first 10 minutes was about us and just seeing where we were, so that the professor could kind of gauge, okay, how do I need to move forward this class period? What's going to be best for them, so that we are able to learn and to take in information. So I really appreciate that. Thank you, Dr. Hickman. So some of the other interventions that I think are going to be really good for everybody to use. Obviously, we've talked about self-compassion a lot here in this presentation, and just being aware of that and knowing that it's okay. The imposter syndrome that we've discussed as well. I still struggle with this. I've been practicing for over 15 years. I know what I'm talking about, but there are still moments in the DOC program where I think that about myself, like, who am I to think that I know what I'm talking about and doing? So this is a very real thing that happens. And obviously perfectionism. I learned very quickly in the DOC program that it's okay to make a B. Now, I haven't made one yet. And I laugh because I had to get to that point with myself to go, you know what, it's okay if I make a B in this class, it's okay. The world is not going to fall down around me. I've got to kind of have some balance. And it all worked itself out, as it always does. But again, these are things that I struggle with. So that transparency piece is really big. Something else that's really good, obviously, is to build those interventions within your program. I love that Texas A&M, one of the things they do is they call them doctoral seminars, but they also have master's seminars, graduate student seminars, whatever you want to talk to them, where they're usually on a Saturday. Sometimes they're during the week, it's in the evenings as well, but you can come at the time you could go. Obviously now they're on Zoom and they're talking about different things. It could be self-care. It could be something specific in counseling, education, and psychology. It could be something very specific about it, maybe a topic. It could be on self-compassion. It can also be on how to get through graduate school and not lose your mind. So those type of things where they're giving you, tips and tricks, and you forget that not everyone gets the same information as other people. And I realized this again 2 weeks ago, speaking with Dr. Mathews and Dr. Hickman, and they brought up a a website that was so helpful to them in their PhD program, never heard of it. And of course, their first response is, how have you never heard of this? I haven't. And so it got passed around enough, but not, sometimes stuff doesn't trickle down like it should from just word of mouth, and professors don't always know. So having those seminars where you're saying, hey, let me help you through this, make sure you know about this website, make sure you know about this, super helpful. Obviously, explicitly teach and model those self-care plans and strategies. Dr. Hickman mentioned earlier, let them see that you do the same thing. This is what I do for self-care. This is how I do things. And you'll have to teach them. Sometimes people have never done these things, and or they've heard of them, but they've never actually done them themselves, right? We all know to journal, but how many people actually journal? That's a really good way to put it to you, right? So make sure that you've done these things and that you know what to expect, and and to teach them and allow them the space to figure out what might work for them in those strategies. And then again, don't forget those basic coping skills, like the one I just mentioned. There's some really good basic coping skills that can help when we're all so stressed at this level right now. And from journaling to all those really great apps now. And of course, all these applications have been coming out even more so, I think, with COVID. You know, we listed a couple there, but Insight Timer is a good one. It's Calm is another app that's a big one that's out there. But they have meditations in them, they have courses in them, they have music in them, they have all kinds of different things. As I say, you want your team, your people, your students, you want everyone to have a coping skill that they can use in the line at Walmart or in class in a moment. And those are things that people can use maybe really quickly or to step out during the break and just to kind of refocus and help them out. So those are just some more things that might be helpful to you guys with your students.
Thank you. One more thing I wanted to say about self-care. I'm a little bit obsessed with self-care and the concept of self-care. I feel like in our counseling programs, we talk about self-care, but we often don't take time to really teach it, or we just expect students to know self-care, obviously. One thing that I love to do, especially in Zoom times, is when we take breaks, I talk to them about Zoom fatigue and things like that. And I tell them during our break, you are not allowed to sit and stare at your computer for 10 minutes and wait for me to turn my camera back on. You're not allowed to do that. I want you to go away. I want you to take a break. A couple of times I've done a calm meditation during the break. And I've told them, you don't have to do it with me, it's fine. But a lot of them do. And then after the break, I ask them, what did you do for self-care during your break? So I try to talk about it a lot and just kind of infuse it into every class that I teach, because I really feel like we need to model to students that it's our ethical responsibility to care for ourselves and to make sure that we are caring for ourselves so that we can adequately care for our clients. So I wanted to take a minute before we wrap up to just check in with you guys and see, are there any interventions that kind of spoke to you, or any that we left out that you've tried that worked with your students? And also feel free to say anything in the chat. I can't see the chat, so if there's anything that comes up, feel free to share. But I wanted to give some of the introverts room to talk if they would like to. So we'll kind of end today. We'll end today with a quote that I really like from Glenn Close, of course, an American actress. She said, "What mental health needs is more sunlight, more candor, more unashamed conversation." And I just love this quote so much, especially the unashamed conversation, because I think the more that we model that it's okay to talk about mental health and it's okay to struggle, I feel like students really respond to that. And that as counselor educators, we can be the instrument to make that happen in our classes. And so I wanted to share our contact information. All of us love this topic. We love to talk about self-care. So please feel free to reach out to any of us. if you are interested in this topic or would like more information. I would love to continue researching this area and working in this area, so please feel free to reach out to any of us. And I also wanted to make sure that you guys were aware that some of the research we talked about today is included in our references, so feel free to explore those. Are there any questions or any kind of last comments as we wrap up today? Any feedback? All right. So I think we will go ahead and end. It looks